On screen, Gunnery Sergeant Vince Carter was a picture of military perfection, loud, disciplined, always one outburst away from a vein-popping meltdown. But the man behind that booming voice, Frank Sutton, was hiding a much deeper and more complicated reality. His journey to television fame wasn't just about acting. It was about channeling years of real-life trauma, disappointment, and grit into a character that the world would love and misunderstand. Frank Sutton wanted to be a Marine more than anything. When World War II broke out, he raced to enlist. But something surprising stopped him cold, a color vision test. It disqualified him from joining the Marine Corps entirely. For someone who idolized the discipline and legacy of the Marines, that was a brutal blow. Still determined, Sutton didn't give up. Instead, he joined the U.S. Army and ended up in the thick of combat in the Pacific Theater. He fought in no less than 14 separate assault landings. 14. That's not the resume of a pampered actor. It's the life of a hardened soldier. He was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. That's right. The actor who played a TV Marine couldn't get into the Corps, but bled in the jungle for his country anyway. And yet, no one really talked about that. When Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. first aired in 1964, viewers were instantly drawn to Sutton's commanding presence. His portrayal of Sergeant Carter felt so authentic, so real, that many assumed it was just who he was. But that assumption haunted Sutton throughout his life. People expected him to be aggressive, brash, and constantly on edge. The truth? He was a deeply private, even shy man who preferred books to brawls and hated being shoved into a stereotype. Friends and cast members described him as thoughtful, well-read, and serious about his craft. But once the cameras were off, the real Frank Sutton faded into the background, overpowered by the myth of Sergeant Carter. He rarely spoke about his service. Even when he did, he was humble, deflecting praise, changing the subject. But there was one moment that stood out. When asked if his military experience helped with the role of Carter, Sutton nodded and simply said, "I just remember what it felt like to be scared and trying not to show it." That one sentence told you everything. The rage, the barking, the eye-popping frustration of Sergeant Carter. It wasn't just an act. It was the echo of something deeper. So why did Sutton keep so quiet about his real war record? Some say it was humility. Others believe it was pain he never fully processed. What's clear is this. The role of Sergeant Carter may have been comedy on the surface, but it was built on the scars of a man who had already survived much worse than a misfit private named Gomer. But that wasn't the whole story. What people didn't see off camera would reveal an even more surprising truth. To millions of Americans, Frank Sutton was the embodiment of the hot-headed military man. His voice could cut glass. His scowl could shut down a room, and his delivery? Always perfectly timed for laughs. But that version of Sutton, the loud, hard-nosed, red-faced sergeant, was only part of the picture. Off-screen, the man who played Sergeant Carter couldn't have been more different. Quiet, cerebral, even reserved. And when cameras stopped rolling, a completely unexpected side of him would emerge. Frank Sutton wasn't just an actor. He was a deeply curious thinker. Long before his breakout television role, he'd already laid the foundation for a different kind of success. After returning from World War II, Sutton didn't go straight to Hollywood. He went back to school. He enrolled in Columbia University, where he earned a degree in drama, graduating cum laude. That wasn't just some actor dabbling in higher education. He was serious about his craft, about knowledge, and about discipline. His education wasn't a fallback. It was part of who he was. Colleagues often remarked how different Sutton was in private. Between scenes, while others joked or relaxed, Sutton was often reading. Not scripts, books. He was known to carry novels, biographies, even philosophy texts with him to the set. Crew members described him as someone who craved stimulation that went beyond jokes and pratfalls. Some insiders even joked that Sutton had the loudest mouth in showbiz and the quietest mind behind it. It was a strange paradox, and one that kept people guessing. One of the most telling moments came during a political interview Sutton reluctantly agreed to do in the late 60s. When asked to comment on the state of the country, Sutton famously shut it down by saying, "I'm no more an authority than the elevator man." It wasn't sarcasm, it was humility. He knew people projected Sergeant Carter's confidence and certainty onto him, but he didn't feel he had the right to speak on behalf of the American people. That moment stayed with audiences, sparking quiet admiration and plenty of whispers that maybe Frank Sutton wasn't comfortable in the role that had made him famous. There were times, too, when Sutton's refusal to play the Hollywood game rubbed producers the wrong way. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't show up at every party. In fact, he rarely gave interviews at all. It wasn't arrogance. It was distance. The man who made a living yelling on screen had learned to keep his private life silent. Friends said he found joy in his family, in theater, and in literature. Fame to him was just noise. He had other things on his mind, and that created a quiet storm behind the scenes. A man too smart to be a typecast, too serious to fake being Sergeant Carter off camera. But the deeper his audience fell in love with the loudmouth Marine, the more Frank Sutton quietly pulled away. Still, there was pressure building, not from Hollywood, but from within. And what happened next would put that pressure front and center. By the second season of Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C, ratings were through the roof. Millions tuned in each week to watch the unlikely pairing of the gentle, goofy Gomer and the fire-breathing Sergeant Carter. On the surface, everything was golden, but behind the scenes, something wasn't sitting right with Frank Sutton. The pressure was mounting, and so was the friction. Working with Jim Nabors, the actor behind Gomer, should have been easy. Nabors was famously soft-spoken, polite, and rarely ruffled. But Sutton was a perfectionist. Every scene mattered. Every line had to land. He brought a kind of intensity to rehearsals that surprised even seasoned TV crews. While Nabors often played things loose, Sutton came prepared like it was Broadway. At first, that balance worked. Sutton's thunderous energy perfectly offset Nabors' quiet charm. But over time, it became clear they were operating on two completely different wavelengths. Rumors started to swirl. Quietly at first, then louder. Crew members whispered about icy moments between takes. Sutton would grow visibly frustrated when scenes got too goofy or dragged on. He hated wasting time. He wanted precision. And when it wasn't there, his irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. Though he never exploded publicly, his eyes said everything. One producer later recalled, "Frank had a temper, but it was silent. You don't want to be in the room when he stopped talking." Jim Nabors, meanwhile, was entering a different phase of stardom. As his singing career began to take off, there were growing concerns that his attention was being pulled in too many directions. Some even accused him, quietly, of phoning in performances. Sutton, who prided himself on discipline, took that personally. He felt the show deserved full effort, every day. When the lead seemed distracted, it clashed with everything Sutton believed in. Tension built steadily, not with shouting or drama, but through long silences, stiff rehearsals, and separate dressing rooms. It wasn't open warfare, but it wasn't friendship either. By the fourth season, insiders say the two barely spoke unless cameras were rolling. When they did talk, it was strictly professional. A cold kind of professionalism that made others on set uncomfortable. And yet, none of it showed on screen. Sutton was a master of control. No matter how strained things became off camera, he flipped a switch when the director called action. That discipline, ironically, came from his real military background. No matter how he felt, he never let it affect the mission, but everyone around him could feel it. The role that made him a star was also boxing him in. Privately, Sutton began to wonder how long he could keep it up. The character he'd brought to life was eating away at the man he actually was. The loud, aggressive, barking sergeant had become a kind of armor, but armor gets heavy, and the weight was starting to show. Then came a decision that would change everything. Jim Nabors wanted out, and Sutton He saw it coming, but he wasn't ready for what came next. It wasn't just a surprise. It was a gut punch. When Jim Nabors announced that he was stepping away from Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., the cast and crew were stunned, but no one more than Frank Sutton. For years, Sutton had built his life around the show. He hadn't just memorized lines. He had become Sergeant Carter. The role consumed his schedule, shaped his public identity, and in many ways defined his purpose. And just like that, it was gone. Nabors said he was tired. 5 seasons, endless reruns, side projects, and national fame had worn him thin. He wanted to focus on singing, theater, and his own peace of mind. The network tried convincing him to stay, but he wouldn't budge. Sutton, who'd already grown distant from Nabors off camera, didn't fight it. Publicly, he was gracious. Privately, people close to him said he was devastated. There was talk of a spinoff. Executives considered centering a new show around Sergeant Carter. Sutton was intrigued, but cautious. He didn't want to be trapped in that role forever. But at the same time, it was all the industry saw him as. Scripts began to pour in, but they all wanted the same thing. Another angry sergeant, another shouting authority figure. He turned most of them down. "I already played that man," he told one friend. "I don't need to become him." What followed was a strange, quiet period in Sutton's life. He wasn't out of work, but he wasn't in demand either. Offers came in fits and starts. He made guest appearances on a few variety shows, dabbled in theater, and even took some roles in commercials. But none of it hit the way Gomer Pyle had. The fame, once blinding, had started to dim, and for a man who'd spent years in the spotlight, it was hard to adjust. Even more difficult, public perception. Everywhere Sutton went, he was still Sergeant Carter. Fans would shout the catchphrases at him in public. Kids would salute him in grocery stores. Adults asked him to yell like on the show. What started as flattery quickly turned into something else. A prison, no matter how hard he tried to move forward. People only saw the drill sergeant. They didn't see the Army veteran, the Columbia graduate, the theater actor. They only saw the mask. Sutton's family said that during this time, he became more withdrawn, not bitter, just quiet. He started pouring more energy into local theater productions, craving the authenticity and respect that TV no longer gave him. On stage, he could be someone else. Not a punchline, not a caricature, just an actor doing the work. And audiences loved it. Though the crowds were smaller, the applause meant more. But the pressure never fully left. The expectations, the typecasting, the shadow of a role that made him but never let him go. And in 1974, just as Sutton seemed to be finding peace on the stage, fate had other plans. Because what happened next stunned everyone. And no one was prepared for the final chapter. June 28, 1974. The small town of Shreveport, Louisiana, buzzed quietly with the excitement of live theater. Frank Sutton had arrived days earlier, headlining the stage play Love, a sharp romantic comedy far from the military typecasting that had followed him for years. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh chapter. On that humid summer night, Frank walked into his dressing room between shows. Business as usual, but he never came out. He collapsed almost instantly, a massive heart attack, sudden and devastating. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but was too late. Frank Sutton, just 50 years old, was gone. News of his passing sent shockwaves across the country. Fans couldn't believe it. How could the loud, fiery, tough-as-nails gunnery Sergeant Carter be gone, just like that? But those who knew Sutton weren't surprised by the silence that followed, because that was how he lived. No scandals, no media storm, just quiet dedication, and then nothing. He died doing what he loved, acting on stage, in front of real people, away from the lights of Hollywood. To those closest to him, it was poetic, tragic, yes, but fitting. Frank Sutton had always carried himself like a man at war with his own fame. For all the applause and tension Gomer Pyle brought, it also pinned him to a single image, one he spent years trying to outgrow. And still, the tributes poured in. Jim Nabors, shaken and emotional, released a short statement calling Sutton a brilliant performer and a good man. But beyond the headlines and sound bites, there was a quiet realization among Sutton's fans. They'd only known half the story. They'd seen the rage, the bark, the drill sergeant swagger. What they hadn't seen was the war hero, the scholar, the husband, the father, the man whose greatest performance might have been hiding just how much weight he carried. His family kept things private. A quiet funeral. No red carpets, no cameras, just close friends and relatives. Sutton's wife, Toby, whom he married in 1946, never spoke publicly about her husband's struggles with fame. But years later, their son Joe, who became a successful playwright, said, "My father was much more than a character actor. He lived a full life and paid a price for that character's success." The legacy Frank Sutton left behind was complicated. To millions, he would forever be Sergeant Carter, barking orders and stealing scenes. But behind that iconic role was a man desperately trying to be seen for who he truly was. A man who served his country, who read Chekhov between takes, who loved the stage more than the spotlight. And in the end, maybe he got what he really wanted. Not fame, but respect. Not celebrity, but authenticity. The kind of legacy that doesn't scream, but lasts. But even with all that, one question still lingered. A question fans and critics kept asking for decades. What really happened on that set? And did Sutton ever truly forgive what Gomer Pyle took from him? For decades after Frank Sutton's death, his legacy remained largely untouched. Fans remembered him fondly. Reruns of Gomer Pyle. U.S.M.C. kept his name alive, and his character became a symbol of classic American television. But the deeper story, the man behind the role, remained locked behind polite tributes and public silence. Until recently. In 2023, a forgotten audio interview surfaced, quietly uploaded by a university archive digitizing old tapes. It was recorded in the early 70s, just a few years before Sutton's passing, and it revealed something astonishing. For nearly 50 years, Sutton had never spoken publicly about the tensions on the Gomer Pyle set. Not once. But in this interview, recorded during a break from one of his theater runs, he finally let his guard down. The interviewer had asked a simple question. "Do you miss the show?" There was a long pause. Then Sutton said, "I miss working. I miss doing something that people care about. But the show? No, it boxed me in. You know how some people get typecast? I became the type." He went on, carefully, not bitterly. Jim Nabors was good at what he did, but we were never close. We worked different. We thought different. I respected him, but it was never easy. The tape crackled, and Sutton gave a tired laugh. I was yelling half the time because I was frustrated. Not at him, at the job, at how small it made everything feel. That one line, how small it made everything feel, hit like a gut punch. The man America saw as larger than life was quietly suffocating in a role that made him famous. More revelations trickled out in the years that followed. Fellow cast member Ronnie Shell spoke at a TV reunion in 2024 and admitted that Sutton had struggled more than people realized. He was a private guy, real serious about his work, but I think he was lonely. Not in a sad way, just removed. Even Jim Nabors, before his own death in 2017, once hinted in an interview that Sutton didn't love fame the way most people in this business do. He loved the work. That's what kept him going. In the age of viral documentaries and social media nostalgia, Sutton's story has begun to reemerge, not just as a footnote to Gomer Pyle, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fame can elevate someone and trap them at the same time, of how the loudest characters sometimes belong to the quietest souls. And for many fans, this lost side of Frank Sutton only deepened their respect for him. The decorated soldier who became a punchline, but never let it define him. The Columbia graduate who played the clown, but never stopped reading thinking, evolving. The man who shouted on screen, but lived in near total silence off it. Now, decades later, Frank Sutton's voice is finally being heard, not through a drill sergeant's bark, but through something more powerful. Truth. Frank Sutton never wanted to be famous. He wanted to be great. And in a way, he was, but not for the reasons people thought. It wasn't just the bark, the fury, or the perfectly timed punchlines that made him unforgettable. It was the depth he carried beneath all that noise. A war veteran who turned pain into power. A disciplined actor stuck inside a cartoon character. A man whose silence said more than any of Sergeant Carter's screams ever could. His story isn't just about Hollywood. It's about identity. About what happens when the world falls in love with a version of you that doesn't feel like you at all. Sutton spent his final years trying to reclaim that identity. Not with interviews or press tours, but through small plays, quiet towns, and moments of real connection. And maybe that's what makes a story so powerful now. Because in a world obsessed with shouting the loudest, Sutton's life was a quiet act of rebellion. He chose authenticity over attention, work over fame, truth over comfort. So the next time you catch an old rerun of Gomer Pyle, watch closely. Behind the barking and eye-rolling, there's a man who gave everything to that role, maybe too much, but also a man who finally found peace by stepping away from the lights and towards something real. Frank Sutton never told the full story while he was alive, but now, after all these years, it's finally being heard. If this story gave you a new perspective on a Hollywood legend, make sure to hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts or memories of Frank Sutton. Did you grow up watching Gomer Pyle? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dig deeper than headlines. Because sometimes the loudest voices are hiding the quietest truths.